The forest was seething that dawn, atmosphere so dense it attached to every inhalation. Insects shrieked above the noise of footwear crushing damp earth. A cluster of Japanese medics, garments ripped and marked with perspiration, emerged from the verdant fog. They had exhausted their morphine supply 2 sunrises prior, nourishment the sunrise preceding that. When they observed the American squadron, weapons elevated, they halted as though the ground itself had gripped them. A single shouted directive pierced through the moisture. "Remove clothing, crouch low." The translator hesitated, doubtful. The females remained immobile, pupils enlarged, digits quivering, soil smeared across their countenances. It wasn't merely terror. It was the degradation they had been instructed to anticipate if seized. In their consciousness, capitulation signified shame more severe than mortality. For several extended moments, nobody stirred. The sole noise was the sound of a weapon mechanism being pulled backward. The squad leader's inflection intensified. He reiterated the directive more deliberately this occasion, more frigid. The translator ultimately faltered through the conversion, his vocal cords wavering. None of the females comprehended why they were being disrobed, or why the Americans continued examining their physiques for concealed weapons. In Japanese instruction materials, seizure implied suffering. In actuality, this was an examination protocol, standard and methodical, but that subtlety was abandoned between dialects and moisture. One medic murmured to another companion, "They will execute us presently." Alternatively, a medical officer advanced with protective coverings and examined their garment parts, fastenings, and footwear for blades or explosives. Customary procedure following intelligence of self-termination. Assaults masked as capitulations. Intelligence suggests beyond 3,500 Japanese female support personnel were seized throughout Southeast territories by 1945, numerous equipped with concealed poison capsules. The Americans weren't merciless. They were petrified. From the detainees' viewpoint, this was inconceivable. Being commanded to disrobe by the adversary wasn't simply vulnerability. It was the destruction of a complete doctrine. Yet in that suspended instant, something transformed. The combatants didn't mock or assault. They simply examined, acknowledged, and withdrew. The females comprehended this wasn't degradation preceding termination. It was bewilderment, wariness, procedure. One of them subsequently documented in her personal record, "We believed this was humiliation preceding death." But nobody perished that sunrise. The sole element that fractured was conviction, the conviction of what they'd been informed about their adversaries. And as the Americans' footwear pressed nearer through the soil, a different variety of terror materialized, not of perishing, but of being misconstrued. Precipitation commenced to descend in delicate, metallic strands, converting the opening into a section of gradual, shifting soil. The identical American squad leader stepped forward, liquid trickling from his headgear edge. He reiterated the directive. This occasion more gradually, his inflection bearing exasperation rather than threat. The translator, an anxious Filipino enlisted man, wavered again. His Japanese lexicon was incomplete, adequate for directives, inadequate for subtlety. The terminology he selected converted examination into disrobe. That singular mistranslation suspended the instant in chronology. The females, horrified, accepted the rumors they'd absorbed since Manuria, accounts that seized medics were violated preceding termination. One grasped a diminutive stitching implement concealed in her garment, prepared to puncture her own throat if necessary. The squad leader observed her action and shouted another term, but the precipitation drowned his significance. For a pulse, the two factions stared across the soil, each believing the opposite was seconds from aggression. Then a senior medical officer stepped forward, appendages elevated, articulating gently. He demonstrated an examination, tapping his own garment sections, displaying his vacant palms. Gradually, the communication connected. The Japanese females commenced to cooperate, rigidly removing fastenings and dressings. Their vision darted toward the translator for signals that never materialized. Subsequently, field documentation exposed that beyond 80% of Allied translators in the Pacific weren't completely proficient, frequently self-instructed during abbreviated preparation intervals. 62 combat activities were documented with critical conversion errors that nearly initiated conflicts. This was among them. The Americans weren't savages. They were frightened. Self-termination explosives masked in medical containers had eliminated several medics weeks previously. Every motion seemed like an ambush. One detainee murmured, "They weren't creatures, simply terrified of our concealed weapons." When the examination concluded, the females were provided coarse military coverings and instructed to remain seated. The soldier retreated, doubtful how to behave. Around detainees who appeared more like depleted scholars than combatants, the squad leader removed his headgear, cleaned his countenance, and articulated something beneath his exhalation. The translator didn't convert it, but one term was distinguishable: protocol. For the initial occasion, the strain dissolved not with amusement, but with an uncomfortable quietness, substantial enough to occupy the forest. The medics, still trembling, comprehended that mortality had bypassed them, but in its location, another sensation infiltrated curiosity, because what arrived next wasn't brutality at all. It was attention. Darkness descended like fabric across the forest. The precipitation eased into vapor, and the sole illumination originated from wavering lanterns around the American encampment boundary. The Japanese females remained beneath a temporary covering, trembling, appendages enclosed in coarse coverings. Every creak of footwear, every sound of metal caused them to recoil. They anticipated mockery, discipline, perhaps more severe. But alternatively, someone approached carrying something that radiated faintly golden in the flame light. A metal container, preserved fruit, the combatant stated, kneeling. He propelled it across the soil, then retreated. The females didn't stir. One ultimately accessed it with trembling digits, the pleasant aroma ascending like something unreal, preserved fruit in a conflict zone. She hadn't experienced sugar in lunar cycles. That darkness the detainees observed Americans consume from identical provisions. No preferential handling, no amusement at their expenditure, simply quiet consumption and the occasional cough. Then, astonishingly, one soldier provided them utensils. It was the most minimal gesture, yet it fractured years of manipulation in an instant. According to supply documentation, U.S. field provisions averaged 4,000 calories per rotation, nearly double what Japanese forces obtained. Protein, sugar, even confection bars were customary allocation. For the females who'd endured on grain and saline liquid, this was industrial prosperity beyond comprehension. One medic documented subsequently, even their detainees consumed superior to our combatants. As the intervals elapsed, they comprehended something even more peculiar. No sentinel struck them, nobody shouted. Alternatively, a medical officer arrived with antiseptic and dressings. He gestured for their appendages. Reluctant, one female presented hers bloodied, damaged. The medical officer applied disinfectant and stated nothing. The sensation burned, but the motion disarmed her more than any weapon could. Across the encampment, another combatant jested quietly with his colleague. And for the initial occasion since seizure, the females perceived something they hadn't anticipated from the adversary. Amusement that wasn't merciless. It was commonplace human. Subsequently, as they reclined beneath damp coverings, they listened to the faint resonance of machinery somewhere in the obscurity. Transport generators, mechanisms of perpetual provision. For them, supply chains had been deprivation. For the Americans, it was standard. And in that distinction, something fundamental fractured. The adversary wasn't primitive. They were structured, nourished, and alarmingly productive. The flame illumination wavered against the medics' countenances, reflecting both terror and amazement. Beyond, footwear pressed toward the shelters again, this occasion not with weapons, but with additional dressings and a singular metal vessel steaming in the darkness. By sunrise, the precipitation had ceased, but the forest smelled of deteriorated medicine. The Americans had mobilized rapidly fabric extended across bamboo supports, forming what resembled a compact medical facility. A manually inscribed marker read isolation. Interior, the atmosphere resonated with disinfectant and the hiss of heating liquid. The Japanese females were directed inward, not as detainees this occasion, but as patients. The conversion was almost surreal. Where they anticipated enclosures, they discovered beds. Where they feared restraints, they observed cleansing agents. The U.S. medical officers functioned in quietness, garment parts elevated, vision concentrated. They weren't tender precisely, but they were systematic. An enlisted man indicated a metal basin, appendages cleanse. The translator's vocal cords trembled through the conversion, but the significance was sufficiently apparent. Individually, the females scrubbed. The liquid converted gray, then brown, then black. It wasn't simply dirt departing, it was lunar cycles of conflict. An American medic entered next, her garment rigid, her countenance professional. She commenced examining the detainees' injuries, marking their documentation. Tropical illness, intestinal affliction, fluid depletion. Her pronunciation segmented the terminology into cadence. Documentation from that interval confirmed that U.S. field medical facilities in the Pacific processed beyond 12,000 individuals every lunar cycle by mid-1945. Illness was more lethal than projectiles, and the medical officers handled even the adversary, because infection didn't consider about banners. One Japanese medic, fevered and frail, murmured something the translator barely captured. "Why assist us?" The medical officer raised shoulders. Regulations are regulations. The contradiction penetrated deeper than antiseptic. The identical doctrine that commanded their seizure presently demanded their attention. When the females emerged from the shelter, they appeared less like detainees, more like apparitions freshly cleansed for a different afterlife. The American encampment smelled faintly of caffeine and fuel. The forest beyond smelled like everything they'd abandoned: perspiration, explosives, terror. They observed something else, too. The combatants' garments, mended and dusty, but intact. Their footwear didn't deteriorate. Their provisions didn't vanish. This was a domain of supply chains, not declarations. And in the center of it, the females comprehended that authority wasn't always brutality. It could also be competence. As the solar sphere climbed higher, one of the medics captured the distant noise of amusement from beyond, a peculiar melodic noise they'd never perceived from the adversary. She inclined toward the shelter opening to listen, not comprehending that the subsequent noise, the sound of a documentation book closing, would mark the subsequent turning point in their detention. The amusement beyond faded into the rustle of documents. Squad leader Robert Lane remained beneath a dim lantern, his dorsal against a provision container, precipitation tapping the fabric above. His protective coverings rested beside him. Soil smeared, ripped at the digit tips in his grasp a compact documentation book. Each surface already mottled with perspiration and pigment. He inscribed like an individual attempting to rationalize with himself. They appeared more like scholars than combatants. One notation commenced, vision sunken, appendages raw. They couldn't have been senior than 20. The Americans surrounding him consumed tobacco, jested, engaged in card activities. Lane didn't participate. His obligation had been to secure the detainees, but what persisted with him wasn't the activity. It was the countenances. He'd observed males perish, but never adversaries so delicate. Somewhere profound internally, a boundary he didn't recognize existed had commenced to obscure. Field documentation subsequently confirmed that nearly 40% of U.S. frontline combatants maintained personal records during World War II, though most were confiscated or censored following the conflict. Lane's wasn't. It endured tucked interior his foot container, smudged but legible. His terminology displayed a combatant wrestling with obedience and compassion in the identical exhalation. He portrayed the encampment's quietness following illumination, perceived the females murmuring in Japanese, the sentinels pretending not to perceive, the aroma of medicine still adhering to their appendages. Directives are directives. He inscribed again, but the phrase trailed off mid-line, as though he'd ceased accepting it halfway through. At one point, he documented an exchange. "Why are they so quiet?" someone inquired. "Perhaps they believe we're going to eliminate them tomorrow," Lane responded. "Are we?" "No, not unless someone instructs us to." That was the conflict in a phrase. Nobody recognized the regulations anymore, solely that they had to continue pretending they did. Near the conclusion of his notation that darkness, Lane closed with a phrase that seemed like admission. "We were instructed to handle them with consideration, but nobody instructed us how." He closed the documentation book, propelled it into his container, and stared toward the medical shelter where the females presently slept. In the faint radiance of sunrise, the initial evacuation directives arrived through. Movement at sunrise. He didn't recognize it yet, but that march would become the most extended rotation of their detention. The signal resonated at sunrise. Sharp, metallic, conclusive. Forest vapor adhered low as the formation of detainees commenced to mobilize. Japanese medics, still frail from fever, transported what minimal they possessed. Containers, coverings, fragments of dignity. American sentinels bordered them on both flanks, weapons angled downward but prepared. Nobody articulated. The conflict had already concluded in principle, but out here in the sweltering peripheries of the Pacific, tranquility hadn't caught up yet. The march to the shoreline was supposed to require 6 intervals. It required 8. The temperature was pitiless temperatures exceeding 110 degrees F. The root a fractured strand of soil and coral stone. One female collapsed preceding midday. A medical officer elevated her onto a transport meant for provisions. Lane walked beside them, tallying steps instead of distances. Indigenous villagers observed from a separation, vision enlarged, murmuring. To them, the scene must have appeared inverted. Americans accompanying Japanese detainees instead of the opposite manner. Some expelled on the ground, others presented quietness. Lane observed how his own males tensed when passing civilians, digits brushing mechanisms. One combatant articulated, "Maintain them mobilizing, no halts." Another added, "Command states evacuation by sunset." But it wasn't hostility driving the tempo. It was terror of assault. Documentation from the sector displayed guerrilla assaults still occurring weekly, remnants of forces refusing capitulation. Every rustle in the forest seemed like the commencement of a conflict. From the detainees' perspective, it was something else entirely. They observed Americans protecting them, literally positioning between them and the villagers' stare. They protected us. One medic subsequently inscribed from their own. By mid-afternoon, the saline fragrance of the ocean drifted through the vegetation. The noise of aquatic birds seemed unreal following weeks of weapons discharge. The females damaged and drenched in perspiration commenced to comprehend this wasn't a march toward discipline. It was transit. Destination unknown. Lane announced a brief halt near the elevation overlooking the inlet. Below, vessels floated in the solar light, gray silhouettes waiting like apparitions. The shoreline shimmered, metallic and motionless. He glanced backward at the column of depleted detainees and articulated to nobody. 18 distances, they achieved it. The aquatic breeze circulated inward, transporting both relief and the faint aroma of fuel. It seemed like liberation's periphery, but not theirs yet. Because beyond that azure horizon waited an encampment, and a standard none of them could have conceived. By evening, the detainees reached the shoreline, a section of scrubland carved into neat formations of shelters. The atmosphere smelled of saline, petroleum, and disinfectant. American guards remained on timber watchtowers, silhouetted against the descending solar sphere. A signal severed through the noise, and the females were arranged, tallied, and provided numbered identifiers. No designations, simply digits stamped in metal. This was Camp Redleaf, one of 27 U.S.-operated POW locations across the Pacific by late 1945. It wasn't luxury, but it was structure. The medics, still disoriented, were displayed their quarters. 6 to a shelter, 1 petroleum lamp, 1 container, and rigid regulations. At sunrise, a signal. At darkness, quietness. The standard was military precision converted inside outward. Every dawn, the identical pattern unfolded. Signal, attendance verification, provision formation, medical examination, then rest. For females instructed to obey Japan's rigid doctrines of loyalty and quietness, detention became its own peculiar discipline. They scrubbed their own beds, arranged their own coverings, learned the cadence of their sentinel's footsteps, and gradually something commenced to transform. The terror dulled into standard, standard into endurance. Lane observed from the boundary. Documentation book again in appendage. He observed details the others missed. The manner they inclined slightly, preceding consuming. How they articulated thanks in Japanese, even when nobody comprehended. One dawn, he observed a young medic attempting to interpret an English marker beyond the nourishment shelter. Maintain area cleansed. She traced each character with her digit, murmuring the phonetics. When he inquired what she was executing, she glanced upward and stated gently, "Learning your terminology." That instant, diminutive and uncomfortable, adhered with him more than any confrontation he'd engaged. The Americans, too, appeared to relax. They ceased staring like sentinels and commenced behaving like colleagues, compelled to share the identical sunburn and monotony. They exchanged tobacco for sketches, cleansing agents for stitching repairs. The females even commenced stitching ripped U.S. garments, a reversal that unsettled everyone initially, then became commonplace. Still, every noise of machinery beyond the barrier reminded them this was not liberation. One medic subsequently inscribed, "We became digits, but cleansed ones." As darkness descended, the generators expelled to vitality, bathing the encampment in faint yellow illumination. And beneath that resonance, one vocal cord fractured the quietness, reading quietly from correspondence she'd never be permitted to dispatch. Late darkness in the barracks transported a noise different from the forest documents, the gradual, careful rustle of writing, implements scratching across salvaged fragments. The Japanese females inscribed when the encampment went quiet, following the sentinel's circuits, when the sole illumination originated from the waver of petroleum lamps. They inscribed to families they weren't certain were vital, to fathers who'd never pardoned capitulation, to offspring too young to remember their countenances. They didn't possess envelopes, simply arranged surfaces tucked beneath coverings. Some illustrated diminutive flowers in the borders, others apologized for still respiring. The gesture of inscribing was rebellion in its gentlest form. Lane observed one darkness while patrolling a female, crouched by the lamp illumination, oral parts mobilizing silently as she inscribed. He didn't halt her. He simply acknowledged and walked beyond. Subsequently, he'd learned those correspondences would never depart the encampment. Under Red Cross agreements, all POW mail passed, through Allied censors initially, and by August 1945, beyond 60,000 POW correspondences were collected and withheld, numerous secured in storage until 1952. Anything emotional, political, or defeatist was marked undeliverable. The females inscribed anyway, as though terminology could traverse oceans without permission. One correspondence discovered decades subsequently reads simply, "I am vital but diminished." That was adequate. Every dawn, censors arrived through the encampment officers with crimson writing implements, examining for forbidden phrases. Remorse, disgrace, self-termination. Complete paragraphs vanished underneath diagonal strokes. The females never recognized. They solely observed their surfaces returned vacant with a diminutive notation held for examination. To them, it seemed like being silenced twice, once by seizure and again by compassion. Lane commenced retaining some of the discarded correspondences, inserting them between surfaces of his personal record, not out of sympathy, out of curiosity. He desired to comprehend what quietness sounded like on documents. By September, the detainees no longer inquired when they'd be liberated. They simply inscribed. The terminology became anchors, a ritual. When you can't articulate to the world, you construct one instead. At sunrise one dawn, an enlisted man entered with a different directive in his appendage, his footwear departing dark impressions across the sand surface. The correspondences halted mid-phrase as everyone glanced upward. Whatever arrived next, it wasn't going to accommodate in an envelope. The rotation commenced like any other signal: attendance verification, provision formation. But by mid-morning, the atmosphere altered. The sentinels assembled near the transmission shelter, their countenances unreadable. A faint interference bled through the encampment loudspeakers, followed by a vocal cord none of the detainees recognized. It was gentle, ceremonial, and trembling. The translator listened initially, vision enlarging. Then he murmured the impossible. "It's the Emperor." The females suspended. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese Emperor's transmission traveled by shortwave to every Allied location across the Pacific. It was the initial occasion his population had ever perceived his vocal cord, and the terminology distorted by interference and separation were capitulation. No celebrations originated from the detainees, no weeping either, simply motionlessness. One female pressed her appendages to her auditory organs as though refusing to accept it. Another stared at the ground, oral parts mobilizing soundlessly. For them, capitulation wasn't salvation. It was erasure. Everything they'd endured, every directive they'd obeyed, dissolved in several trembling phrases from an individual they'd been instructed was divine. Beyond the barbed barrier, the Americans didn't celebrate either. They simply listened. One transmission operator removed his auditory devices and murmured, "It's concluded." But the terminology hung substantial, like it didn't quite recognize what to execute with itself. According to Allied documentation, the Emperor's communication reached Pacific outposts within 6 intervals of the original transmission in Tokyo. For the detainees, it was the initial evidence that their homeland still existed and that it had ceased engaging. Lane inscribed in his personal record that rotation they didn't celebrate. They simply stared at the soil. Afterward, a young medic inquired him quietly, "Does this signify we can return home?" Lane wavered. He didn't recognize how to state that tranquility on documents didn't signify liberation in practice. There were still vessels to arrive, documents to authorize, examinations to traverse. Conflict might be concluded for governments, but for detainees, the waiting had simply commenced. That darkness, The encampment illuminations remained activated extended than customary. The transmission continued resonating, replaying intelligence from Tokyo, demolished cities, burned harbors, the phrase unconditional capitulation. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japan was silent, but interior the barrier. Quietness was the sole noise that constituted comprehension. And as the transmission faded into interference, the subsequent directive arrived, one that would ultimately dispatch them toward home. The encampment portals accessed not with fanfare, but with bureaucracy. The conflict was technically concluded, yet the machinery of record-keeping circulated onward. Transports arrived bearing Red Cross insignia, white circular shapes on fading pigment. Soil smeared across the flanks. From them descended physicians, clerks, and photographers. Their mission was elementary: tally, document, and return. The Japanese females were arranged beyond the barracks beneath the dawn solar sphere. Documentation boards resounded, cameras flashed. For the initial occasion since seizure, their designations were inscribed downward in completion. A medic glanced at her own identifier, simply a digit till yesterday, and murmured her actual designation aloud, as though testing whether it still belonged to her. Each female traversed through a formation of tables, one station for digit impressions, one for medical examination, one for photographs. 3 angles, no expressions. Red Cross documentation lists display 3,121 Japanese females processed for exchange in 1945 to 46, most from the Philippines and New Guinea. The medical officers weighed them next physique by physique, statistic by statistic. One officer articulated 92 pounds. She's heavier than the previous one. The data signified endurance. The inflection signified detachment. Lane remained nearby, assigned to accompaniment obligation. He attempted not to observe, but couldn't assist observing the peculiar blend of ritual and relief. Every motion was mechanical, yet beneath it circulated something unspoken gratitude blended with disbelief. When the medic from the forest formation reached the medical table, she inquired in faltering English, "You dispatch us home." The Red Cross official glanced upward, half expressing, "If the aquatic behaves," that response persisted like prophecy. Behind the formations of processing shelters, containers were accumulated with coverings, cleansing agents, metal vessels of provisions, adequate to endure the voyage. Each female obtained one collection. Interior one detainee discovered a reflective surface enclosed in fabric. Most hadn't observed their reflections in lunar cycles. The initial glances were painful, countenances more slender, senior, but vital. The conclusive halt was documentation, declarations confirming they'd been handled according to the Geneva Convention. The contradiction wasn't abandoned on them. When it was concluded, they were directed toward the shoreline. Vessels marked the horizon, gray, low, and waiting. Machinery thudded gently across the surf. Lane observed them. Embarked the transports that would transport them to the docks. He inscribed one final phrase in his documentation book. "We had to demonstrate they were vital proceeding we could permit them depart." And outward at aquatic, combustion from the waiting vessels smeared the atmosphere like a promise half retained. The dock groaned beneath the mass of footwear and containers. Saline wind whipped through the formations of detainees as they ascended the gangway onto a gray transport vessel. The aquatic was restless, marked with foam. The horizon so luminous it obscured the vision. The American sentinels didn't shout directives anymore. They simply indicated and assisted them embark individually. For the initial occasion in lunar cycles, the females perceived the solid vibration of machinery beneath their appendages. Fuel vapors blended with ocean spray, forming an obscurity that adhered to their epidermis. The vessel's horn resonated, a low, mournful notation that circulated across the inlet and into the forest behind them. Camp Redleaf vanished into separation, its shelters contracting to dots. Interior the vessel, beds arranged the metallic walls. No restraints, no enclosures, simply narrow locations, shared provisions, and an unspoken truce. Lane was assigned to supervise one of the lower compartments. When he traversed through, several of the medics inclined slightly. He didn't recognize whether it was consideration or custom. Perhaps both. They sailed eastward. The voyage from Manila to Yokohama spanned roughly 1,800 distances, requiring 22 rotations if climate held. The Pacific extended perpetual and indifferent, each wave erasing another fragment of conflict. At darkness, the females remained at the barrier, observing phosphorescent illumination shimmer in the liquid. No boundaries, no noise, simply the cadence of the aquatic, reminding them how diminutive endurance actually was. The sentinels, too, softened. They shared tobacco, caffeine, even jests. One combatant exchanged a confection bar for a manually stitched patch. Another presented his container to a fevered detainee without contemplating. For an instant, adversary and ally obscured into something elementary, simply population waiting for home. Lane inscribed, "The ocean didn't consider who had prevailed." Still, every sunrise seemed heavier. The females would wake to aquatic birds circling above, wondering what waited on the opposite flank. Japan had capitulated, but nobody recognized what capitulation would resemble once they positioned ashore. Some murmured about demolished cities, others about families departed. By the 15th rotation, the atmosphere grew more frigid, the waves more turbulent. Storm warnings arrived through the transmission. Season approaching rapidly. The captain commanded hatches secured and emergency vessels examined. The females assembled below compartment, listening to the wind commence its extended ascending howl. And somewhere above them, lightning flashed like a camera capturing chronology mid-exhalation. The atmosphere collapsed into gray. By midnight, the Pacific converted violent waves hammering the structure, precipitation slicing sideways across the compartment. The vessel lurched metal, groaning beneath the strain. Interior, the illuminations wavered, then dimmed to emergency radiance. Containers propelled across the surface as the personnel shouted directives through the wind. The Japanese females adhered to beds and barriers, vision enlarged, exhalations sharp and rapid. Nobody slept. Every sound of thunder sounded like artillery returning from the past. The aquatic heaved, tossing memory and terror together until neither constituted comprehension. Lane engaged his manner downward to the lower compartment. Liquid pulled at his footwear. He discovered one of the medics crouched beneath a support, appendages enclosed around her knees, murmuring in Japanese. A prayer, perhaps, or simply a cadence to endure the noise. He steadied her appendage. She glanced upward, vision wild with panic. "We perish," she inquired, vocal cord nearly abandoned beneath the roar. Lane oscillated his cranium. Not tonight. He didn't recognize if it was accurate, but stating it mattered. For intervals, the storm ripped at them. The vessel tilted substantially to harbor, then corrected itself, machinery expelling through the swells. An emergency vessel fractured loose, colliding into the waves below. In the chaos, hierarchy vanished. Americans and Japanese alike grasped ropes, steadied supports, evacuated liquid. Endurance reduced everyone to the identical rank. Historical documentation confirmed that the 1945 typhoon season submerged 19 Allied vessels, eliminating hundreds even following the conflict officially concluded. Nature hadn't authorized the capitulation. The medic grasped Lane's garment, murmuring something he couldn't perceive. When the lightning flared again, he observed her countenance, clearly saturated, pale, trembling, and comprehended she was no extended afraid of him. Simply of the aquatic, he stated nothing. She would subsequently recall, "He simply held my appendage." By sunrise, the storm commenced to fracture. The atmospheric formations thinned, the waves softened into extended circulating swells. Exhaustion replaced terror. The detainees emerged onto the compartment, perceiving at the washed-out horizon. And then someone indicated. Faint through the vapor, a dark formation elevated from the liquid. Territory. They remained appendage to appendage, follicles plastered, garments ripped, saline crusted on their epidermis. The vessel's horn sounded once low, steady, triumphant in its own quiet manner. Japan was outward there waiting, but what waited on territory would not be the home they remembered. When the vessel ultimately anchored at Yokohama, the atmosphere transported no celebration, simply the aroma of combustion and corrosion. Japan wasn't the homeland they'd departed. It was a graveyard constructed from concrete and quietness. Combustion still drifted from ruins on the horizon. Pathways once crowded with banners presently held solely bicycles, debris, and stray canines. The Japanese females positioned off the transport individually, enclosed in U.S. Army coverings, identification identifiers still suspended from their necks. Indigenous population along the dock stared as though apparitions had walked ashore. No celebrations, no embraces, simply murmurs that severed deeper than the aquatic ever could. Seized females, someone articulated. Disgraceful, they'd endured everything the forest illness storms and presently confronted the sharp periphery of their own society. Documentation from Japan's post-war Ministry of Health display that nearly 70% of returning POWs, male and female, confronted discrimination or employment abandonment upon return. For females, it was more severe. Capitulation equaled dishonor. Numerous families refused to accept them backward. One medic attempted to provide her repatriation documents to an indigenous officer. He wouldn't contact them. "You were in adversary attention," he stated flatly. "You're not registered yet." Lane observed from the pier, appendages buried in his compartments. His unit had been commanded to supervise disembarkation preceding returning to Manila. He observed the identical females who had marched barefoot through forest presently walk across their homeland like trespassers, their appendages straight but vision hollow. He contemplated of his personal record notations, how he'd inscribed about their quietness, their endurance. Presently, that quietness occupied the harbor itself. Nobody articulated, nobody gestured. The conflict had concluded, but compassion hadn't followed it home. One of the females reached into her container and discovered a diminutive fabric bundle. Interior rested an arranged correspondence, the one she'd inscribed lunar cycles previously, never dispatched. She stared at it for an extended duration, then tucked it backward away. Some communications weren't meant to travel. Lane closed his documentation book one conclusive occasion. The Red Cross officer nearby announced outward the final formation digit. The vessel's horn sounded behind him, signaling departure. He didn't glance backward until the dock was vacant, simply damp boards, fading impressions, and a singular metal container departed positioned near the gangway. Interior that container waited the most diminutive fragment of the conflict, still unspoiled, and one of them was about to access it again. Years elapsed. The conflict became memory. The ruins converted into transparent material and concrete, and the world mobilized onward, except for her. The medic from that forest opening resided quietly in a rebuilt Tokyo dwelling, her follicles marked with gray, her designation still half, murmured in her neighborhood. On a timber surface near the aperture, she retained one peculiar relic of the past, a damaged U.S. Army container of preserved fruit. The marker had extended faded metal dulled by decades of atmosphere and duration, but she never accessed it. Visitors sometimes inquired why she retained a fragment of the adversary's provision in her residence. She always provided the identical response because it was the initial element that wasn't hatred. That darkness in the forest, the container propelling across the soil, the pleasantness she could barely experience, had outlasted every garment, every banner. It wasn't about the fruit. It was about the impact of benevolence from an appendage she'd been instructed to terror. Official post-conflict documentation list millions of American field provisions allocated through 1945, each one containing a 4-ounce container of preserved fruit, customary dessert for combatants and detainees alike. Most were consumed and forgotten, but this one became a monument to contradiction. Sometimes when Tokyo trembled with precipitation, she'd polish the container gently with a fabric square, vision abandoned somewhere between memory and disbelief. That darkness, beneath a covering of provision containers, she had learned something that no transmission or capitulation articulation could instruct, that conflict wasn't simply engaged with weapons, it was endured with motions. She'd observed the most severe of humanity, and still discovered a rationale to remember the most diminutive gesture of decency. Not because it erased the suffering, but because it demonstrated something interior. Population refused to perish. Her personal record notation from 1946 reads simply, "Benevolence was the sole element we weren't instructed for." Beyond her aperture, Tokyo illuminations shimmered across the rebuilt skyline, neon reflections where combustion storms once burned. She didn't designate herself a survivor, and she never articulated of Lane or the encampment again, but the container remained, silent and complete. When she perished in 1972, it was discovered on that identical surface, still sealed. Archivists subsequently positioned it in a museum labeled solely Personal Item, 1945. And beneath the transparent material, that diminutive damaged container radiates gently, even presently evidence that compassion once provided doesn't deteriorate.